corruption. Some complain that people will then report wrongdoing because they want money. But I say, so what? If they disclose corruption and the country recovers money that it might otherwise not have been able to recover, so what is the problem that they disclose this information because they want money? So it would appear that the Department of Justice is doing something with regard to the protection of whistleblowers. The question is simply whether it is enough. I know that you will then consider in your conference and deal with the question of whether what the department proposes is enough. I also want to refer to one of the recommendations that were made by the Commission with regard to Parliament, namely the establishment of a portfolio committee that would oversee the presidency. Parliament had indicated that it was undertaking a study of other jurisdictions to see how this is done in regard to the presidency or a prime minister, and I'm not aware that they've made any decision on this. And then I want to also touch on procurement. You will recall that the Commission made extensive recommendations on procurement because it came to the conclusion that most of our corruption comes from procurement. The taps relating to tenders need to be closed. That was the attitude of the Commission. And in this regard, the Commission recommended the establishment of a public procurement anti-corruption agency. The President indicated that that agency, just like the Anti-State Capture and Corruption Commission, would have to be considered together with other suggestions that the advisory council that he has established, the Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, will consider. I'm not aware that the President has made any decision in this regard, but I'm aware that the Public Procurement Bill of 2023 doesn't make any reference to such a body and makes a reference to a tribunal. And it seems to me that when one has regard to the features of the Public Procurement Anti-Corruption Agency that the Commission had in mind, and one looks at the tribunal that the Public Procurement Bill of 2023 has, it seems that there is very little that the two have in common. It would be a pity if ultimately the President does not embrace this decision of a Public Procurement Anti-Corruption Agency. Because of all the recommendations, in my view, that was the most important. And it had features, the recommendation had features that we have no doubt would make a serious dent on corruption in this country. So, but the President has not said that he has rejected that, but it is strange that the Public Procurement Bill doesn't refer to it. And yet in his response last year, he had indicated that the Public Procurement Bill would accommodate most of the recommendations of the Commission on Public Procurement. In fact, the President had indicated that they accepted and supported most of the recommendations of the Commission. But when in regard to public procurement, but when you look at that bill, I think there are only about 4 out of 10 or more recommendations that the Commission made, only about 4 that seem to be giving effect to. Before I finish, I just want to refer to the reaction of the private sector to the report of the Commission. In this regard, I've been particularly impressed by the role that Business Unity South Africa and Business Leadership South Africa are playing in trying to make sure that the recommendations of the report are implemented. I'm aware that BUSA has concluded a memorandum of understanding with the NPA with a view to ensuring that a certain category of recommendations of the Commission are implemented. And I'm aware of the role that BLSA and maybe Business Unit South Africa as well have played together with IPS to produce an anti-corruption working guide, which for companies in South Africa, which gives guidance to companies as to how to tackle corruption. I have no doubt that if many companies embrace that guide, that will go a long way to making a dent in corruption in the workplace. And I hope that many companies will embrace it. Lastly, I want to say to CASAC and PARI and other organizations which have stood up to put pressure on government to ensure that the recommendations of the Commission are implemented. Your role in the fight against corruption is noticed. Please continue. There are going to be challenges on the road ahead as all of us who fight corruption continue our fight. It's not a rewarding job, but all of us need to do it for this country, for our children and their children. Please go on with the good job. And I think that one day, South Africa will thank you for the role you are playing. Thank you very much.
Chief Justice, thank you very much. You don't know this, but we were interrupted a little bit, those of us that are here. I'm reliably told that the live stream was not affected. And therefore, if you want to see the 2 minutes that we missed here whilst we were dealing with the outage, it is available on YouTube, on the recording on YouTube, or where all of this is recorded. So thank you very much, Chief Justice. And just to also let you know that the presidency helped us open this conference yesterday by giving us an update of where they are with the implementation of the recommendations. So, and they're still here today, and I'm sure all that you've said will be taken back. And as for the civil society organizations that are here, we've also taken note of what you're saying and how we can just carry on and move on to advocate for the implementation of these recommendations. So we thank you very much for joining us. Those of you who came in whilst the Chief Justice was presenting, just know that he was live. He joined us, and we thank him very much for shifting around his schedule today to be with us here this morning, seeing that we couldn't play his recording yesterday. And as I said earlier, we think we had it better today because we had him talk to us and he can hear us. So thank you, Chief Justice. We are back to our program. I just would like to also mention that PARI is working on another book on the Zondo Commission, and we are at the very, very starting stages of this book. And Bongiseni and Sarah and Devi are the coordinators of this book. I think they'll be editing it as well as providing chapters. So if you want to collaborate with us on the book, Bongiseni is here and Sarah is here, you can just contact them, okay? I'm sure you'll be looking for chapters very soon, and asking for chapters very soon. So I think they just want to clinch the deal here whilst it's still hot. And also to say that at the end of the conference today, we will be hosting drinks. If you can join us, we'll be very pleased to just let our hair down, those of us who have hair. Those of us who wear wigs will not take them off, I promise you that. So just join us for drinks at the end of the conference. I think we'll be at the end, as you walk out here, there's a lounge at the end there. We'd be very happy to have you. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome again on day 2. I'd like to call to the stage. Firoz is not on the stage, is he? Okay. I'd like to call to the stage Firoz Kachalia, who is the chair of NACEC. The president, the Chief Justice mentioned NACEC. He's the chair of NACEC. NACEC is meant to advise the president on how to implement the anti-corruption strategy. And he's joining us this morning to speak to us about where they're at and what they're doing. And Firoz, please welcome. Thank you.
If I want to move a slide, I just... Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. See very familiar faces. I couldn't participate yesterday, and I tried to join online, but I wasn't successful, and so I missed quite a few presentations that I was particularly interested in, especially the session on the role of the corporate sector, for reasons that may become clear after you've heard my remarks. I'm sort of slightly intimidated by having to follow the Chief Justice, who's played such an enormously important role in bringing us to the point that we have a serious conversation about the challenge of fighting corruption, and the enormous evidence that was before the Commission now we have a public record which supports this initiative. Okay, I can't see what's in front of me.
Maybe put the lights up a little bit.
It's sort of what do I do?
Let me load your presentation. 1 second.
Okay. I'm afraid I have prepared a presentation, so I don't... So what, you want me to look at the screen? Or maybe I can stand in front of your computer, Davy?
Yeah, I'm just setting it up for you.
Great. So how do I move the slides?
So use these.
Okay.
And then just tell me when you're changing, then I'll change on the screen.
Okay. Okay, that's our logo. Can you see? Okay, so, you know, we've made some progress. Okay. So I think the adoption by the Cabinet of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy about 2 years ago Okay, that's the first slide. No, I'm still on the first slide, Davy. Okay. As well as the appointment of the council, affords us an opportunity to tackle the challenge of fighting corruption effectively by adopting a comprehensive, multidisciplinary approach. What we call an all society approach. So there's a paradigm shift that we have to engage with. We have to build upon, but go beyond the state capture by the Zupta framing of corruption, involving a small network of individuals. And the framing of the challenge of implementing an anti-corruption strategy by focusing exclusively on the very specific institutional recommendations of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. So let me be clearly understood. I'm talking about building on its accomplishments, but at the same time recognizing that questions of institutional design and of institutional reform require careful, critical engagement. That is the approach we're adopting in the Council in examining our attitude to these very specific recommendations. For instance, the establishment of an independent and separate procurement agency, the establishment of a separate and independent whistleblower agency. I read the summary report produced by Perry last night. I want to congratulate Mungezi and Perry because it's an excellent report, and it does exactly that. It engages critically with the specific recommendations of the Zondo Commission. We need a response to the current patterns of corruption, state capture, Zupta, but also start to think broadly and strategically about corruption risks, including those not investigated by the Zondo Commission and future risks. Because when you're thinking about institutions and radically transforming them, introducing new institutions, you want a future-proof strategy, not a snapshot approach to the fight against corruption. So what do I mean by the paradigm shift? The National Anti-Corruption Strategy, and many of you here were involved in developing that strategy, wasn't developed top-down by government. It drew on the best expertise available in the country. So it has 6 pillars. We have to look at, in thinking about implementing an anti-corruption strategy at all 6 pillars. That's what we mean by a multidisciplinary approach. Think, if you like, about even a challenge of fighting crime. We understand that fighting crime requires a comprehensive set of responses that focuses on law enforcement and prevention, behavior change. So what are the 6 pillars? They're there. Most of you are actually familiar with them. Promote and encourage active citizenry, number 1. Advance the professionalization of employees in the workplace. Enhance governance and accountability in all sectors. improve integrity, transparency, and credibility of the procurement system, strengthen the resourcing, coordination, performance, accountability, and independence of dedicated anti-corruption agencies, and protect the vulnerable sectors that are prone to corruption. 6 pillars. The Council is focused on all 6. So what kind of body is the NECAC? I want to talk about this because I think our role is not widely understood. I mean, at least in the public domain. We are an advisory body made up mainly of people who are appointed because of their expertise or their role in civil society. We have 6 work streams. Whistleblowing, and the Chief Justice says we should focus on whistleblowing. We agree. So we are focusing on whistleblowing. That work stream is headed by Thandeka Kubula Mbeki. The procurement work stream, again, another focus area, is headed by Advocate Kumalo. Procurement monitoring and evaluation by Sikotlani Pamodi. Communications by our Deputy Chair. Legislation and transparency by Kavisha Pillay. And the anti-corruption architecture, which in some sense spans the work of the Council, is headed by Dave Lewis, who's sitting in front of me. And I believe many of the members of the Council participated yesterday. Those working groups are working very hard. They all have reference groups, and many of the experts in the field of fighting corruption have been incorporated into these reference groups. I see Professor Claren there, but many of you are involved in those reference groups. We are making sure that in our approach, we are bringing in the anti-corruption community to work with government to design interventions that are likely to work. Once we were appointed, we realized that the implementation of this strategy that was adopted by the Cabinet 2 years ago has to be an iterative one, by which I mean 2 things at least. One is that although we are appointed by the President to advise as an independent body, and we are protecting that independence, we will advise the President based on our evidence and our thinking. But it's an iterative process because implementing this comprehensive all-government approach requires us to work with many government departments. The Department of Justice, obviously, but the Department of Education, because as you might have heard yesterday, I didn't hear the presentations. I don't know what the DG reported, but I see Jonathan Sims is here. The government, the implementation of the Zondo Commission recommendations and the implementation of the strategy, in my view, is being taken seriously by the government. The DG has invited the Council to participate in the DG's forum, precisely because we have an overlapping mandate. If we're considering whistleblowing and questions of institutional design, so is the Department of Justice. So we have to make sure that we're in a dialogue with them, and that in considering various steps that have to be taken in the process of implementing the strategy, obviously we have to be working with all the departments while protecting our independence. And so the decision of the Director General of the national government to involve the council was, to us, an indication that our role is valued and that the government is taking the implementation of the strategy seriously. That doesn't, we have had many points where it appears that processes are protracted. We have, we are not, I mean, we have been constrained by a lack of resources, but we are not preoccupied with our constraints. We are trying to tackle this challenge, and I can tell you that this council and the people on it are committed to this fight. And we've had the privilege of encountering many people in government, and particularly the heads of the law enforcement agencies who are on our side, who are part of the fight against corruption. Now, the way we think about remedies for corruption depends on how we conceptualize corruption. And I think that that is a conversation we should not take for granted. Because we use this concept in a taken for grantedness way, as if we all mean the same thing. I am going to delineate schematically two ways of thinking about corruption and its remedies. Both are correct, but one is too narrow. And the one that is too narrow dominates the public discourse. So what is the way of thinking about corruption which is too narrow? To reinforce the point I'm trying to make, that the adoption of a multidisciplinary and comprehensive strategy and the appointment of this council helps us to think differently, more broadly, more strategically about the fight against corruption. So what is the narrow approach? It focuses, let's call it, as I say, a famous judge also, Judge Krickler, sitting in the audience. So it's the juridical approach. It reduces corruption to the conceptualization of corruption and the remedies for corruption within a legal and legalistic paradigm. It equates corruption with illegal actions like bribery, what could be called in the literature quid pro quo corruption, and fraud, for which the proper remedy is indeed after the fact investigation and prosecution of individual acts of criminal malfeasance. So the focus that this approach leads you to is mainly to the misconduct of administrators and politicians. It is also punitive. What it emphasizes is the punishment of individuals. And so it's not surprising if you're thinking in these terms, you'll come to the conclusion that the remedy for fighting corruption is to establish a single anti-corruption agency which has a monopoly of prosecutorial and investigative powers. What this leaves out is what paradoxically you could call legal corruption, corruption that isn't identified in the law like PRECA, institutional corruption, which the Zondo Commission's evidence led it to, hence its focus on procurement, and what I'm going to call systemic corruption. Systemic corruption is a concept that we're beginning to debate in the Council, but we're at the early stages. As far as I'm aware, IPID is legislation that incorporates this concept, but nobody has been able to define it. And maybe it's not a concept that can be defined in law. And it dominates. This is the perspective that dominates public discourse. Now, Of course, we have to ensure that we improve investigation and prosecution of criminals in our fight against corruption. And so the focus on the role of the NPA, the SIU, the ID, and so forth is critically important, but it's not enough. What is the broad approach? The broad approach recognizes, and you can see why a council like ours would be adopting a broad approach, recognizes the diversity of corruption problems. Not all forms of corruption are illegal. It can include forms of nepotism, collusion between private sector agents in the procurement process, like price fixing, conflicts of interest, raising perhaps ethical questions, the capture of policy-making processes, regulatory processes, democratic political processes. Much of the avenue for that is the private funding of political parties. It is what is destroying democracy in the United States. We have to be able to look at the United States and saying we're going to prevent that from happening here, although I think we're already well along that path in South Africa. Institutional corruption. Institutional corruption breaks from this individualistic, legalistic paradigm. The evidence before the Zondo Commission led them to think about patterns, networks. So we started in the council a debate on systemic corruption. I would encourage a book that I'm just starting to or reading, which identifies 4 syndromes of systemic corruption. I think South Africa incorporates all these elements. But the one element that we haven't had a focus on, and where I think respectfully the Zondo Commission was in a sense under-inclusive, was a focus on what this author calls influence markets. The intersection between the private sector and the public sector, in the way in which wealth and power is accumulated. So a comprehensive, one other point, we also need to be aware of the informal norms that underpin corruption practices in organizations. So if there are these informal norms that are difficult to reach, they're difficult to reach by the law, by a exclusive focus on procedures. If we're going to tackle corruption, then we have to be aware about what's going on in our society, what norms outside of the law shape behavior, and have strategies to deal with what could be called kind of the normative structures which support corruption in our society. So a comprehensive, multidisciplinary approach adopts a wider set of remedies to address corruption challenges. So corruption includes public and private collusion. It includes individual criminal acts, but we also need to look at institutional and systemic forms of corruption. Certainly, state capture involved the abuse of public power by a network of highly placed administrators and politicians. Acting the definition is that they were acting for private purposes. That's the accepted definition. But really what this was about was the enrichment and accumulation of wealth and power in our society in ways that are improper because they undermine democracy. But state capture also included a network of enablers, accountants, lawyers, as well as private organizations, numerous corporations, some incorporated in multiple jurisdictions, banks, large consultancies with accounting practices, engaged in collusive dealings with the state, who were apparently among the primary beneficiaries of state capture. So look at the evidence before the Zondo Commission. And so I think Paul Holden was right to say in his recent book that this was a matter that didn't receive sufficient attention in the Commission. Now, that's not a criticism of the Commission. The Commission was bound by its terms of reference, and it was a judicial commission of inquiry. Now, Pillar 5 has got to do with looking at the institutional architecture. David heads up that work stream. The way we are approaching that question is concretely and bottom up. We're not simply looking at the comparative experience, because we have to understand the institutional map, the institutional infrastructure of anti-corruption institutions that already exist. Now, I don't know if you can see that. Law enforcement agencies, we have the MPA, the DPCI, the AFU, the South African Police Service, Crime Intelligence, and IPID. On prevention side, we have the SIU and various departments. On the coordination side, we've had some success with the Fusion Center. They did excellent work on COVID. But the institutions that were set up, the ACTT, which has now been replaced for coordination purposes, was, I think most people would accept, was a failure, and was only recently replaced. Then we have intelligence gathering agencies, the FIC, the South African Revenue Services, the Auditor General, SAMLET, that deals with money laundering, the South African Reserve Bank. When it comes to discipline and ethics, we've got the PSC and the DPCSA. And on procurement, and then the Zondo Commission has made a recommendation for 3 new institutions. Frankly, without adequate evidence, without the proper process of inquiry to come to those conclusions. Procurement, whistleblowing, all separate institutions, and a permanent judicial commission of inquiry. Now, what I want to stress here is, how do you think about introducing a new anti-corruption institution, designing, we have in place a multi-agency framework for fighting corruption in place. They all consume resources. They all, in some sense, have their own mandates. They have their own interests. I don't mean illegitimate interests. So the task of introducing new institutions and redesign them requires a proper methodological approach to arrive at conclusions, setting up new institutions that can work. Justice Krichler would have played a prominent role in the process of redesigning our political institutions when we adopted our new constitution. How thorough, how careful, how considered were we in approaching that project? We are in a period 30 years later where we, in effect, are having to rethink comprehensively our political and perhaps even our economic arrangements. We have to be as considered, as thoughtful, as careful. The Zondo Commission made a recommendation that we now need an elected president to fight corruption. Well, there's a lot of literature which suggests that that's precisely what we shouldn't be doing in a jurisdiction like ours. Now, the point is simply to stress that, almost done, that this is what we've got to undertake. So, there are some critical questions of institutional design, which I'm going to list some of them that we're considering in our work stream. I am not, I think it wouldn't be correct to, we are close to a consensus on some of the critical parameters of a new institution. We're close to parameters. We're planning to report next year, but I want to make sure that we reach complete consensus supported by evidence before we come to conclusions which to share publicly, because we haven't even communicated our views to the President as yet. But what are the questions that we are considering? And that should give you some signposting about where we're going. We've started with what the main functional gaps are in the current institutional matrix. Institutional corruption, which the Zondo Commission does try and address. Policy making, including monitoring and evaluation, and citizen participation. It's not there yet in the current institutional matrix. A new anti-corruption institution is probably needed to focus on prevention and power, and it should have powers of proactive, as opposed to after the fact, proactive investigation into institutional corruption, something like procurement. And so possibly a new institution, anti-corruption body, will include an institutional capacity to deal with procurement corruption. If this new body has investigative powers, the challenge is going to be to define its scope, because any decision we make in this regard is going to have an impact on the investigative powers of other existing agencies. We have to think about that, not behave like a wrecking ball. So we probably are not going to recommend the establishment of an institution, new anti-corruption institution, which has a monopoly of prosecution and investigative powers, and which combines prevention and punishment. And I'm going to explain a little bit in my next slide why. Should the new anti-corruption agency have a mandate to deal with conflicts of interest? It's not all conflicts of interest which are corrupt are illegal. And I know, talk to a lot of politicians. They think that when there are conflicts of interest, if not illegal, then there's no problem. But there's a big problem with conflicts of interest in a society like ours. Next, what should the legal form be of any new institution if such an institution is established? Should it be a statutory body or a constitutional body? We have not resolved this question. I have my own views, which since David is here, I'm not going to articulate publicly. Oh, well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we're having a debate. I think it should be a body. I'm almost done. Next, the challenge of coordination, effective coordination. That's not only an architecture problem, it's also a problem of institutional culture. So this is my last slide. I think we're in a period now where we have to move from anti-corruption policy to thinking about how to implement an anti-corruption strategy effectively. And the international evidence is that to achieve results is over the long term, with a comprehensive, to deal with corruption comprehensively, the results are not emphatically positive. It's a huge challenge. It's a long-term challenge. So, avoid a simple borrowing of a toolkit from a supposed global consensus. How often do we do that? Next, adapt your anti-corruption responses to specific anti-corruption problems and institutional conditions in your own society. Prioritize and sequence critical interventions incrementally, like public sector reform or procurement reform or whistleblower protection. Next, recognize that there is no panacea or quick fix. Next, avoid giving too much importance to short-term solutions, orange overalls. That's how we judge the conviction rate. That's how we judge whether we're making progress. But in a high corruption situation like ours, prioritize the strengthening of investigation and prosecution capabilities. So I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be looking to the NPA, the ID, the SIU, and the DPCI not to get better results in the investigation and prosecution of criminals. Whoever they are, the higher they rise, the harder they should fall. Do not assume that corruption problems are the same everywhere. We have to understand, have a fine-grained understanding of corruption in South Africa. Avoid an overemphasis on reform from above over contestation and mobilization from below. Build a base of support politically. A new agency should have a role, a specific role in public education, public mobilization, and public participation. And that's why it would not be compatible with the inclusion of prosecutorial powers which require confidentiality, objectivity, and impartiality. Next, link implementation of anti-corruption strategies to citizen well-being, the improvement of services, health services, systems of policing, and so forth. Tembisa hospital is a very good example. Let's not go to Tembisa and say, let's fight corruption. Let's fight corruption by improving their health services. Finally, understand anti-corruption as an issue of fundamental justice, implicating the way we are governed and the fairness and inclusivity of our political and economic institutions. It's not simply, it is, but it's not simply a problem of individual immorality and criminality. So let's not avoid, we should not avoid moral discourse. But we need a wider approach, one that is more likely to win in the long term, more likely to mobilize our people in this fight, because those are some of the essential ingredients of a successful anti-corruption strategy, which may take us 10 years, 20 years, but we will win this fight if we do the right things, and we must win this fight, as Justice Zondo was saying, because it's an existential one. We did not fight to live in a corrupt society. We fought for a just constitutional democracy. That's what this fight is about. Thanks very much. Thank you. Sorry, I took too much time.
You'll be using this mic.
Thank you very much, Professor Feroz Kachalia, for that. we decided to give you an entire half an hour so you can tell us where things are at and what they are looking like. And it's very clear that you have done more than a logo. You are molding how this institution is going to look like and what issues it's going to tackle. So if people have questions, the prof is still here, I'm hoping, and there are other members of the council that are here. David Lewis has been with us the 2 days, and I think Tandy was also here yesterday. So thank you very much for that, Prof. I think with that, we've changed the program slightly because obviously the address by the Chief Justice was very, very important to us. So we are going to be moving very fast. We won't break your necks, but we are going to be moving very fast. I think now it's time for us to go to our fourth session, which is the guardrails and infrastructures for integrity in public procurement. And I am inviting the facilitator for this up, Caroline James from, okay, I'm looking at hands everywhere, I'm getting distracted. Caroline, please come up. Caroline is the advocacy coordinator at the Amapungane Center for Investigative Journalism. I'm also going to invite your panelists to come up. Mutlatsi Komote from Corruption Watch, Budget Justice Coalition, okay? And I didn't prefix your name because I did not know whether to say Ms. or Mr. You know our names, There's a Mutlatsi who's also a man, so Ms. Mutlatsi is here. And Simon Apple is joining us online, if I'm not mistaken. Sarah, he's joining us online. Okay, he'll be joining us online and giving his presentation online. So, Caroline, as we did yesterday, you will introduce your panelists fully. You have until 11:30 for this session. Okay, I will help you with time if you can't. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone here joining us for this session. I think yesterday had been very grateful to Advocate Matibe for creating the perfect setup for this panel when he said that 90% of the SIU matters emanate from procurement. But then Judge Zondo's keynote address provided an even better introduction, and so in some ways I think my job has been done in introducing this panel. I think listening to Judge Zondo was particularly validating for us, and I'm sure many of you in the room, that we, certainly at AMAB, had been fighting throughout the process around the drafting of the procurement bill and the submissions before Parliament on the sense that the bill simply did not address the problems that Zondo had identified, both from what had come out in the Commission, but also Zondo's recommendations. And so to hear him voice that in such strong and concrete ways was really important, I think, because I think it represented the sense that we felt, and certainly many of our colleagues here and on the panel have felt, that the way that the procurement bill process has been approached is just simply not seeing procurement as this ultimate sort of avenue towards wealth accumulation and the facilitation of corruption. And so I think I would like this panel, and I'm sure Mutlatse and Simon online will be speaking to it, but if we can, when we have our discussions, just sort of talk about the idea that we do need a different perception of the policy to underline procurement regulation, that it has to see procurement as this fundamental driver of corruption. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two panelists. There has been a substitution. Simon, I'm not sure if he's going to be as effective as the bomb squad was, but let's see if he can provide that input. But we'll start with Mutlatse Komote, who is a legal researcher based at Corruption Watch and is also the current chairperson of the Budget Justice Coalition and sits on a board of the Centre for Women and Children. And we've certainly worked very closely with Mutlatse at Corruption Watch, and her input to Parliament on the public procurement bill was very effective and strong, including leading to certain responses from members of the broader community, particularly the Black Business Council. So, Motlatse, if you could take us away.
Thank you. Morning, everyone, and thank you, Caroline. Hopefully I'll do it justice today. But I just wanted to start off by saying, for everyone here, before I even get into the recommendations that were made by the Chief Justice, just to give a bit of a background on this public procurement process that we found ourselves in. I mean, the public procurement bill has been many years in the making. As we all know, I think it's approximately 10 years in the making or so. And we've had different versions, and we've had quite a lot of back and forth at NEDLAC. And so clearly there is a need for this public procurement bill that we found in 2023. This bill was actually introduced into Parliament at the end of June. And I just wanted to start off saying, and this ties in with some of the comments that I'd made yesterday in one of the sessions around meaningful public participation. We, as members of the public, were given approximately less than a month, actually, to really provide input on this very necessary piece of legislation. And so, I mean, that already in itself is something that needs to be interrogated and questioned. And obviously just noting that this is coming at this particular time of the year when all of civil society and everyone is quite inundated with quite a lot of work. And so we had raised, along with other civil society organizations, concerns around these particular timeframes. And so that's something that I just wanted to start off with. In terms of the actual Zondo recommendations themselves, so Chief Justice Zondo, had actually recommended that there be an establishment of an independent anti-corruption agency, which would have an inspectorate, a litigation unit, a court, and a tribunal. And furthermore, he'd also recommended the creation of a national charter against corruption in public procurement, and this was meant to include a code of conduct. Just to start off by saying that the court wasn't established, and like Chief Justice Zondo was saying earlier on, the actual anti-corruption agency has also not been established in terms of this public procurement bill. And so some of the strengths, however, of this bill, regardless of anything, is that first and foremost, it's supposed to create some kind of harmonization in the different pieces of legislation that we have in South Africa. And so we think that this is a good thing, because right now we currently have lots of fragmented pieces of legislation that speak to public procurement in South Africa, which is obviously not useful at all. The second part of it is, one of the strengths of this bill in particular was that it actually went into a little bit more detail around who would be excluded from procuring. And one of those would be the leader of a political party, which we thought was quite good. However, one of the recommendations that we'd made was actually perhaps we need to consider the concept of the politically exposed persons being excluded from procuring as well, because we've seen that that is actually another avenue within which to have more corruption in the procurement space. And so those are the main positives or strengths of the bill. One of the last strengths of the bill is the inclusion of technology in the actual procurement system, which is quite important because it will obviously create more efficiency, cost reduction, and so forth. So I think those are good and well, but there are issues within the bill itself. So the bill creates what is known as the Public Procurement Office. And in terms of this particular bill, the Public Procurement Office is meant to be located within National Treasury. Immediately, we thought that this is an area of concern for us, because you would want, ideally, a Public Procurement Office to have some kind of autonomy. And so we have argued that in order for there to be limited or actually no political interference, you would want a Public Procurement Office that has that autonomy. So the Public Procurement Office is actually meant to deal with professional development and training, the creation of databases, monitoring, and performance. And this particular office can actually issue binding instructions and non-binding guidelines to assist procuring institutions. And so there are questions around this particular office and its transparency in its decision-making, its independence, and whether it will be adequately resourced. Again, just noting the fact that we've recommended as Corruption Watch that it actually needs to be funded by Parliament. So that's the first one. One of the things that was quite disappointing about the bill itself is it does not speak about incentivized whistleblowing. And I'm glad that Sharice is here later on to speak about whistleblowing in particular. But we, both at NEDLAC level and as civil society organizations, had really been pushing for this to be found in the actual bill, and we think it's really a missed opportunity. And we don't think that we would be doing justice to our current status as a country if we do not deal with the whistleblowing element. Yesterday we spoke about the professionalization of procurement officers. That was also another recommendation that Zondo had made. And again, this is not really adequately captured in the bill, other than to say, I mean, that there needs to be some kind of professional development and training of professionals and officials in public procurement. And we think that, again, this is a missed opportunity for the recommendation to really be codified in this important piece of legislation. And then also, in terms of the actual code of conduct, so the bill itself makes reference to a code of conduct, but again, it doesn't really go into detail around who's going to be responsible for this code of conduct. Where will this code of conduct be placed? So there are very significant gaps. So it almost seems like there are things that are put into this bill, and it seems like tick boxing more than anything else. Thank you. Okay, I'll try and keep it quite brief. I've got 5 minutes left. And so we think that this is another gap, and this gap should really be addressed in the bill in order for us to have really an anti-corrupt state. And then lastly, there are also issues around the tribunal. So this particular bill speaks about creating a public procurement tribunal, which is meant to review decisions that have been made on debarment and everything. And one of the concerns that we have is it makes reference to having a sufficient number of persons who sit on this tribunal, but it doesn't in any way say there must be a minimum or a maximum amount of people. And that's always problematic in any piece of legislation. And this tribunal is meant to oversee the decisions of the PPO itself. So it doesn't do much for accountability. Also, there's quite a heavy reliance and centralization of powers to the minister, again, which is something that we have continuously called out and said this is a concern, especially noting what has been happening at state-owned enterprises. And we wouldn't want to find ourselves in this exact same position that we're trying to move away from. So I think that those are the main things. And I think that if the tribunal is meant to act without fear and favor, these things are meant to be sorted out. And unfortunately, this bill has not quite adequately dealt with that. I know that preferential procurement is something that has come out quite a lot in the bill as well. But I think that in order for us to have quite a lot of ethical behavior, we really need to resolve the transparency and accountability mechanisms within this bill. And so, lastly, in closing, I think I've probably got 1 minute, but in closing, just to say that one of the concerns, again, that we have, and this speaks to my earlier point around the public participation processes, is whether any of the recommendations that we have all made as civil society, as activists, as business and so forth will actually be captured in this bill, because the sense is that this bill needs to move and it needs to move fast. And so those are some of the things that are really worrying for us as civil society organizations. And again, it's a missed opportunity to really effectively speak to some of the recommendations that Zondo made. So.
Thanks, Motlatsi. And I think your presentation, and particularly the way you ended it, just highlights why I think the questions of procurement are so relevant to this discussion at this conference, because it touches on so many different strands and threads that we've discussed. And I'd really, in our discussion a bit later, I'd really like to sort of expand on the question of that you raised about the weaknesses that the bill has highlighted in our current parliamentary processes, and whether there's something that we can do about that. But I think next we'll call on Simon Eppel, who is online. I think, is it all set up for him to join us? So Simon is a trade unionist, and he is within the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union, and also serves as a COSATU and SACTU representative on several industry bodies, as well as on NEDLAC task teams and bodies. And our engagement throughout the procurement bill process has relied very heavily on Simon and his expertise, as well as his relationships within NEDLAC and other bodies. So he's certainly someone that has been sort of fundamental to the whole process around the bill's drafting.
Which is a really bad setup if it's such a bad bill. Greetings, Caroline, greetings, colleagues. I've got a presentation I'm going to flight shortly. If you give me a moment to do that, and I set my stopwatch. But I want to say a couple of things to start with. You know, my major lesson from the last, I don't know, 15, 16 years of doing this kind of stuff, not on procurement generally, but on policy matters, is that we're constantly losing. You know, I mean, it's not a question of getting what we want. It's a question of losing in the way that we want. I mean, that generally feels like the game that as progressive activists we're in. It's not it's not winning every time. It's largely trying to determine how we lose in the most elegant, best way to position ourselves for the next opportunity, which may sound entirely cynical. But you know, that's largely, I suppose, the case when you don't have power, or when those who exercise power in various manifestations, forms, levels, so constantly frustrate good outcomes and good intentions. And you know, the next major lesson is that the state appears to be quite similar to that popular TV program, The Game of Thrones, where everyone at every stage is building fiefdoms, fighting each other, etc. It's an enormously dysfunctional entity to drive something coherently through. I'm starting with that before I put in the presentation, because I think it frames the question is, like, I suppose, what was possible. And I'm going to suggest that we've done better. Let me know if the presentation's on the screen, please. Can you see it? Just waiting to see if you can see anything.
Yes, we can, Simon.
Not yet. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to suggest that that there are a number of significant victories in the bill. But there's some very, very, very challenging and problematic sort of bombs that we need to watch for. So you know, that's really the first slide. Then my assessment is we got more from the NEDLAC process than we anticipated we would get. normally when a treasury bill comes, you may as well sort of kiss goodbye to winning things. It tends to be quite a hard line that's taken. It tends to be sort of, take it or leave it. And in this process, we did manage to make substantial gains. The bill that left NEDLAC was better than the bill that arrived in NEDLAC. And that's largely a consequence of the substantial input from colleagues in civil society, the kind of deep strategic thinking, and the general multi-stakeholder, cross-stakeholder, cross-class frustration with the problem of an ineffective, deeply dysfunctional state in public procurement. But so while we made victories, there's still a lot left to do. I'm going to quickly go through some of what we secured, which has been mentioned already, so where there's overlap, I'll leave it. There have been some significant opportunities for transparency, but I don't want to say that we will get them, because my lesson with the state is once it's encoded in law, it doesn't often happen. But these are the things we should keep our eyes open for. So the first one is would be that there's now the agreement on a central portal to disclose tender information free of charge. We've seen municipalities, government institutions charging for tender information. So we've managed to get it in there. It must be free of charge. It must log certain key issues around procurement information. I'll come to that in a moment. And the second one is almost the move to online procurement, to e-procurement of a form. And now that's super exciting because it may solve a data problem. If you achieve option 1, which is an online portal in which tender information must be disclosed, you face the problem that no one discloses. If you can secure number 2, and you can have a platform through which transactions happen, then you can capture the data in that online platform, and that can render it and make it more publicly accessible. So 1 is great, but 1 doesn't make sense without 2, and both of those come out of the bill. In terms of disclosure, some of the things that must be disclosed according to the bill, all information regarding a bid, including the dates and the reasons for the award and the values for the award and the entities, including beneficial ownership. Now that's useful because it raises it to the level of statute. Previously, I don't know whether it was in instruction notes or some treasury instruments. Some of these things were outlined before, but when we wield those policies or instructions with departments to try to get them to disclose to us, they basically give us the middle finger. Now we've raised it into statute, and hopefully it gives us more of an opportunity to demand consistency around the data that's provided. And then there's certain other qualifications around the data. It must be done quickly, online, et cetera, et cetera. But there are still some major problems with transparency, and there's the T-Rex. I'll take you through them quickly. There was in the post-NEDLAC process, I think it is, some changes to a provision that we had secured around special provision for public monitoring, and that had been a provision to develop guidelines or processes by which civil society, the media, etc., have more oversight over and view of tender processes. There were some limitations on that placed in the post-NEDLAC process. So we've proposed at Parliament some ways to remedy that. The second one was that the public process monitoring, the first issue was placed before a broader element that spoke to transparency. In other words, the limitation that we had identified in the first issue may have cascaded to the broader enabling clauses around transparency, which may have been a problem. So we've tried to reverse that. And there's a couple of other issues I won't take you into. I'll take you to the fourth one, which is more important, which is that what we had secured was, what we had asked for was a public record and public disclosure of who should be automatically excluded from tenders and their family members and related parties. What government was prepared to go to was that each public institution keeps a record of that, but not that they disclose it publicly, nor that it's held nationally. Now, that's a really stupid idea. that you just bury it in the deepest recesses of public institutions which don't operate properly. So we've tried to reverse that in our proposals to Parliament. There are a couple of anti-corruption measures that exist in the bill I want to point to. So these have been mentioned already around exclusions, and these were built at the NEDLAC process. There were some elements, but they were deepened at NEDLAC. And it's effectively around political leaders at the national, provincial, and local levels, but also employees of the state of various kinds who are being excluded from tenders entirely. And there's some additional aspects to it. The concept of getting leaders of political parties excluded, I recall, was a NEDLAC innovation. The question is, can we deepen that and make it go further? Can you cascade it, for example, to provincial office bearers of parties, etc.? I would see that we were actually worried that this would be kicked out at Parliament. So we're keeping our eye to make sure that it gets to the very, very end. There's some issues of debarment which are clarified in the bill. They sort of put up front there. You can be debarred for providing false information when registering on a database, if you interfere with the participation of other bidders, if there's any kind of offenses in terms of corruption, fraud, collusion, etc. I won't take you into that, but those are useful. Those are useful inclusions. There's I sort of spoke to this issue just now about the recognition and the disclosure of publicly of excluded persons. There is a process in place for it. It's not sufficient, but there's a process in place for it. There's the opportunity in the bill for lifestyle audits for influential persons. There's a may in terms of this. So Treasury may make regulations for lifestyle audits, and that would be targeting automatically excluded persons and their immediate family members and related parties. And you would have to determine on what basis the lifestyle audit kicks in. Is it that they win tenders above a certain threshold or something? But that opportunity wasn't there. We wanted it as a must. We got a may in the end. I won't spend much time on this one, but this is what I spoke to earlier. We'd created a process for additional oversight and monitoring by the media and civil society, etc. It's there. It doesn't have a shape and a form yet, and it does have a limiting clause on data access now, which it didn't previously. So there are risks around it. The question is, can we manage the risks? Can we mitigate the risks? Can we remove the risks? So those are some of the things that we've managed to gain. In the 5 minutes left, I will just speak to a couple of other issues. One of the kind of major problems going forward in the bill is it's just super broad. So everyone in their, I don't know, and their relatives, I suppose is the good analogy here, is interested in the preferential procurement part of it, of the bill. And that's section 17. That's essentially, if I strip out the niceties, that's the rent-seeking part of the bill. Who's going to get what from public procurement? Who can put up their hand and say, I am owed or I should get? Now, as the trade union movement, we put up our hand and say, our constituency should get. We see public procurement as a lever to drive development, economic development, industrialization. And so we're far less interested in the owner of a company who wins a contract. We're far more interested in the fact that companies, local factories should be in the supply chains. So we're part of, I suppose, in some senses, the rent-seeking crowd, but our interest would be broad-based. We would say pro-social, rather than kind of narrow. If I leave off that part of section 17, the real contest around, what do you want your procurement to do? There's a major risk at the moment, and that's that the bill probably, in fact, we would say doesn't provide a framework for public procurement. What it does is provides 20 categories, roughly 20 categories of preference, various kinds of preference. And then it leaves the task of developing policies to individual public institutions. So roughly 800 to 1,000 public institutions will now draw on 20 categories of preference to design their own preferential procurement policies. It is complete madness. Firstly, we would argue it doesn't fulfill the constitutional requirement for national statute to provide that guidance. So there's a legal challenge, we think. But secondly, I mean, if you say there are 20 variables and institutions can combine them between 2 and 20 variables together, and there's 1,000 institutions, we can have 1,000 institutions coming up with 500, 1 million different versions of public procurement policy. It's going to be unmanageable, absolutely unmanageable. it's going to be a wild west. So we've raised that at Parliament. We're not sure whether or not they've seen it. What we think needs to happen is that the Public Procurement Bill needs to be far more prescriptive on a framework. Otherwise, you essentially outsource it to everyone and their nefarious intents. We've got a particular concern around Section 17, which I won't speak to now for long, but effectively it doesn't do enough to build the broad-based nature of public procurement, the broad-based pro-social elements. So while it speaks to local manufacturing, there are some challenges with it. I won't go into it for the purposes of time. I also won't speak extensively to the issue of whistleblowing, except to say it's not there. And we did fight for it, and it should be there, particularly the whistleblowing incentive component. We understand that the protection measures sit in a different bill, but we do believe it should and would be appropriate to put it in the procurement bill. And I mean, really, there's a little for the Marvel fans in the crowd, of whom I'm sure there are possibly one. The idea is, how do you mobilize in a state of few resources, overwhelmed, capacity constraints, etc.? How do you mobilize the largest number of actors in society to act on behalf of the public interest? And that's what the whistleblowing incentive could do. It could unlock a greater number of people to take forward the public interest. So I won't come into it now, except to say we have made the proposal to Parliament. Our narrow interest, if we're going to speak issues of integrity, the Public Procurement Bill doesn't speak to supply chain integrity. I mean, eventually, if you want to produce a society which believes in the rule of law, you should not be using public finances to award companies that undermine or break the rule of law. And one place that happens is in government tenders. I came across a company the other day that won a very large, several hundreds of million rands worth of tenders, and they locked the door of their factory to prevent the Department of Labor or the police from entering to view what's happening with the workers. Now, we know what's happening with the workers, but at the moment, there's no law that prevents that. We think there's a gap in terms of, let's say we start processing through the pipeline challenges with procurement. We start identifying offenses and people who are committing fraud, corruption, etc. We think that we need to think of the bill as part of a pipeline, and that pipeline is not sufficiently managed if we don't have courts on hand that can begin to process and streamline issues. The last matter to come to is our major proposal for the public procurement bill is just based on experience and the slowness of the state and the never-ending fight to win in the state. We've proposed that there's a review of the public procurement bill within 18 months to look at what's working, look at what's not working, come back to NEDLAC, and then start to do some additional work. We've also proposed that a lot of the bulk work, the grunt work, the heavy lifting that's been left to regulations and instructions, we take that to NEDLAC and at least try and get more heads to think it through rather than leave it to the state. And that is my presentation.
Recording stopped.
Thank you, Simon. That was a really helpful introduction, and I think, as I mentioned, you do have a unique perspective, having been part of the NEDLAC process and the public participation. So I think what I want to do now is just pose a couple of my questions to the panelists, and then I'll open it to the floor for some discussions. And again, I'm very grateful to the organizers of the program for putting us on day 2, because again, most of my work has been done by previous speakers. But I would like to draw on 2 topics that have been discussed earlier in the conference and ask either Moklatsi or Simon or both of you to address those. And then I do have 2 specific questions for each of you. But the broad questions, the first one draws on Professor Kachalia's comments earlier today that we need to see corruption more broadly than purely a criminal act. And my question to both of you is whether our focus on Zondo's recommendations as solutions to the type of corruption that occurred in state capture has tied us to seeing solutions and proposing ways to address that specific type of corruption, and whether our focus in analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the bill in relation to his recommendations weakens our ability to approach corruption on a broader level. And then the second question draws on something that Jonathan Tim mentioned yesterday about the capacity of the state and law enforcement and accountability mechanisms. And he had mentioned that the crisis of accountability is that we can't keep adding controls because we simply don't have the capacity to give effect to those controls. So my question to both of you is, while we're calling for things like greater transparency and greater accountability from accounting officers, are we being naive in expecting that the state has the capacity to either provide the documents, whether to collect them and then have the technology to provide them online, as Simon mentioned the bill does require, and then also, are we being over ambitious in expecting the accounting officers to have both the time capacity but also the expertise to identify and sort of then investigate sophisticated financial crime? And then two specific questions. Simon, to you, I really would like your ideas on how the difference between your involvement in the NEDLAC processes and then the public participation processes have differed. And you've mentioned that you have felt that NEDLAC was very successful for us, and I really liked your identification that that's possibly because of the cross-sector and cross-class frustration where Labour and the private sector were speaking on the same page around what needs to change within procurement. But you also presented submissions to Parliament, and I'd really like your thoughts on whether that is likely to be effective, or whether we do have to rely on the review that you mentioned, and if we take things, both regulations and the bill, in a sort of review back to NEDLAC. And then Mutlatsi, we know, and Simon highlighted and you highlighted, that so much of what is fundamental to the procurement system will have to be sort of addressed in regulation. And if you could touch a little bit on what you know about the process around drafting the regulations and how we as civil society could meaningfully engage on the drafting of the regulation, and to ensure that the content is reflective of our concerns around anti-corruption within procurement. Simon, could you go first?
Progress.
Great. Okay, my heart is racing at these questions. I'm totally ruining the fact that I stood in for Matthew, as you call it, the bomb squad. Okay, let me try and do some justice to these questions. Let me start with the first question around corruption. My notes here say corruption being more broad than simply criminal. I want to highlight a couple of things. The first is, I don't know whether these are going to be useful, but the first is that there is also a material logic to corruption. And I don't like saying this because it's almost an excuse for it, but in a system, if you think about an economy like a river running down a mountain, and in areas of that river, it's like the rocks are there, it's eddying badly, there's stagnation. Corruption, I suppose, is a response to obstacles, and it's not just a moral response, it's a response to obstacles and systems. So what do I mean by that? The one is the ability to make it in an economy. When an economy is this hard, when it is this hard to enter the economy at the level of employee or have upward mobility in an economy like we have, people look for short circuits, which is it's not to say, therefore we must excuse corruption, but there is a material basis for it. So the one is around economic sort of substrata. The second one is around government substrata. So it's the kind of systems in the state. So, I recall chatting to a colleague last year sometime. This colleague was trying to renew their visa at Home Affairs, get a new passport, and they stood in line for 3 days. This person might even be on the call, possibly, but they stood in line for 3 days. and they watched queue jumpers, if I can remember. Now, when the state is as unwieldy and as systemically dysfunctional as it is now, is it any surprise that people try and make their way through a system by rigging a system? So there's a substrata of material defects, which I don't think we must lose sight of. The second one is beyond the kind of criminal element. It's the kind of social sanction element. It's one can have criminal sanctions and then social sanctions. If I can give you an example, let me try and sanitize it. 10 years ago, I met with the ambassador for a country who has citizens in the country who own clothing factories. Those clothing factories are engaged in some of the most reprehensible, revolting, and disgusting forms of abuse of workers I've ever seen. There are in the toilets fabric. I've seen these fabric, not toilet paper, so that the woman must use fabric to clean themselves, and all kinds of problems emerge. Workers were strip searched in the factories, etc. So we went to go meet the ambassador to tell this ambassador, and they had a really interesting response, which was to say, what are you doing in terms of your systems of law? But what we can do is go back to our home villages of these people, give us their names, we'll go back to their home villages and shame them. Why am I giving you a stupid example like that? Because at some level, dealing with antisocial behavior is not only the duty of a state, it's also the duty of the people with whom those actors inhabit their society. Different forms of social sanction we should be thinking of. Now, I'm not sure what those are, but those would not be criminal sanctions. Those would be social forms of sanctions. Let me speak about the capacity of the state. We've all known for a long time that the state is deeply dysfunctional. And I assume that increasingly the kind of open secret is now more and more public, which is that, we are held together by the thinnest of threads in this country, by the appearance of the rule of law and the appearance of a state with capacity. But actually, that state is deeply dysfunctional. Many comrades may point a finger at, for example, at things like austerity, and that certainly will have a role in many parts of the frontline public service, etc. But there's also another level of deep dysfunction that exists. The caliber of thinking that's done. I cannot, in my engagements with the state, I cannot believe state colleagues of mine have so little capacity to understand the real world and problem solve the real world. And that's almost because they are insulated so entirely from the problems. And so time and time again, I meet the philosopher kings and queens of the state who, with the grandest of ideas, which mean really nothing, really it's vacuous rubbish, a lot of it. I'm trying to be the bomb squad here for you and just give you a couple of bomb squad lines, but it is vacuous nonsense in a lot of places. So the capacity of the state is deeply diminished. The response to it cannot be the response cannot be to demand less of our state, but no wise person puts all their eggs in one basket. And so we're going to have to hedge. And hedging is going to have to say, if the people we demand to do the things we need them to do can't do it, how else can we do it? If I can give you a quick example, in our industry, the industry in which I work, we've moved from an industry development platform that largely relies on government policy to an industry development strategy that relies on the inputs of each partner. So I deal with the retailers every day, clothing factories every day, textile factories every day. And the mantra is, we're going to have to do it ourselves. The same logic is going to have to be embedded. How is it that you can diversify the number of actors to reduce the amount of risk on over-relying on people who probably can't do it? Maybe they can, but the process of rebuilding a state is a decades-long process. The last question is around the public participation processes. Genuinely, the NEDLAC process was useful. If we don't do it again, it'll be an enormous disservice from NEDLAC to the public at large. So we need to do such things again. I need to watch my mouth here. The way I see this, So you've got the best way of shaping law through NEDLAC. Once it hits political interests at Parliament, you are substantially constrained by other things. You're substantially constrained by party politics, not just the people in the room, in the committee that you're dealing with, but you're constrained by an enormous number of diffuse web-like influences on those people, not to say nefarious, but influences beyond the room and NEDLAC that you can control. And so my own sense was that one doesn't take too much to Parliament, because you have a greater opportunity to lose it there than to gain it there. But what you do need to gain, you need to narrow down your arguments to the smallest number of arguments and focus just on those. So you can make gains at the parliamentary level, but they don't have the time, nor is there sufficient focus of interest to be able to win everything, which is why in this instance, the strategy was find the key couple of things one can drive through the room there. The biggest influence, I would say, is continue to work through NEDLAC. And that's why we've proposed come back to NEDLAC, come back to NEDLAC, come back to NEDLAC. Is NEDLAC perfect? Far from it. But at least it gives us an opportunity to stretch an engagement over weeks or months if we're lucky, sometimes even years if we're really bad at our jobs. It gives us an opportunity to workshop, to go through the process of trying to influence each other, which is, and influencing someone to believe what you believe or think what you think doesn't take a moment, doesn't take 3 minutes in front of a parliamentary portfolio committee. It's a long process. So my advice would be to focus on the next stages. I hope I've provided something useful in that. Thanks,
Simon. That's very useful. And I think although it's heartening to hear that NEDLAC is positive, I think it also speaks to the sort of whether or not our public participation is actually meaningful and what it means for people who don't have access to NEDLAC, and that are the real people on the ground that should be heard by our lawmakers. Moklatsi, can I hand to you?
Thank you. So I'll start with the capacitation of the state and adding controls. I think that's a very interesting question, because I do believe that we need to continuously capacitate the state. And I think that's where the whole concept of professionalization comes in. If you have professionals that have the necessary skills, expertise, and can be held accountable because they are part of a professional body, I think that might be a starting point, at least, in remedying some of these issues. I think that also, in terms of the state's ability to provide information timeously, I think that our role as civil society organizations is to really pay attention to that as much as possible. So in terms of the bill, there's certain considerations that are being made around uploading information and so forth and providing access to information. Our challenge has been currently that we've had to make use of prior requests, and it's not been conducive at all for us in terms of accessing information. And so where possible, we'd want that resolved. I don't think that we're being overly ambitious. I think that it will take time, like someone has said, but I do think that we need to, where possible, ensure that we have wins in place. On the regulations, that's an interesting one, because a large part of things that are missing in this bill have actually been left to regulations. And again, it calls into question the public participation element of it, because we don't know when these regulations will actually be provided to us by National Treasury. And so in terms of these regulations in the bill itself, so the minister is meant to actually make these regulations, and then he's supposed to, or he or she is supposed to call for a notice for submissions on these particular regulations, and then at some stage they're then sent to Parliament for further scrutiny for a period of, I think, about 30 days. And then there's supposed to be some kind of consultation report thereafter, after that process, where the questions and the answers that National Treasury would have around some of those parts of the regulations would be answered. I just wanted to make a point around the fact that the parliamentary part of it is actually quite important. And I hear Simon's point around NEDLAC and us making use of NEDLAC. I think it's an important point, but not everyone is a part of NEDLAC, like you were saying, Caroline. And so there are benefits to having both processes, I believe. In terms of Parliament, I think that when these regulations come before Parliament, I would strongly suggest that we keep our eyes out on this and we actually ask for lengthier periods of time, not a month, way more than that, for us to really interrogate these regulations. Otherwise, we're going to potentially have another bill that becomes an act and it's inadequate, and we rely on constantly going to court and trying to change what would be in the actual act itself. So I think that definitely we as civil society organizations, activists and formations really need to pay attention to that. And part of the challenge here is actually having a parliament, and I'm just looking now because I'm not sure if I should be saying this out loud, and I'm sorry to Corruption Watch in advance, but and I hope I won't be speaking out of turn here. But we need a parliament that is effective. We don't need a parliament where when you appear before parliamentarians and you're making a submission on such an important bill, they don't really engage, don't really ask questions on the very important elements of this bill. And that was our experience now during this public participation process. And so I think we need to really amplify our voices around the fact that, yes, preferential procurement is an important part of the question, because that was the question that came up quite a lot. But there are other issues around transparency, around integrity, accountability that should be dealt with in this bill. And unfortunately, the MPs during that period of time were not really engaging with these very critical parts that were missing in the bill. And so I think that definitely, I don't know if at some point, once this bill becomes an act, people will want to challenge it in court. I don't know. But I'm just making a point to say that we are going to have a new parliament next year, and we really need to interrogate how effective parliamentarians have been as the lawmakers and as the legislators, and how effective they've, or not effective they've been in performing oversight against National Treasury and other government departments. And I think that that's something that we really need to, if we have this conference next year, really interrogate around how effective they've been in terms of the oversight mechanisms. My opinion is that they can always do better, and this public participation process showed that. And I don't think that at this period in time, I'm sorry, Caroline, I don't think that right now what we're seeing is that we have so many bills before Parliament, and we're rushing through these processes in October, August, September, October, and Parliament's term ends next year. And we've got to really interrogate how serious these bills are being taken and how effective our voices have been. Are we passing through, or are parliamentarians passing through legislation as they are, or are they really interrogating what we as civil society and members of the public would have said around public procurement and other key pieces of legislation? So I just wanted to put that out there, that it is a big cause for concern. I think I've answered all of your questions.
Great. That's it. Thanks, Motlati. Thanks, Simon. I think we're now open to the floor. So I'd like to take 3 questions from the floor, and then are there any online? So I'll take 3 from the floor and an online one. Then I'll ask the panelists to respond, and then we'll take another round. I'll take 1, 2, 3, and then Debbie, will you read from the floor? I mean, from online.
Hi, thank you. I'm Anne McLennan, and I increasingly think that I've been both in government and academic and in an NGO, and now I sort of occupy the space in between, I suppose, and it makes me quite cynical, so I apologize for this it's kind. I suppose it's a comment, but it's a thing that worries me. And what we need to do, particularly when we're thinking about the capacity of the state or any institution, is understand that the institutional norms and practices, the routines that it have, are what norm and form the behaviors of the people in that institution. And neither legislation, nor capacity building, nor professionalization changes that. So you can train people as much as you like. You can be very effective in doing that. They can be fabulous professionals in that sense. But if they go into a system where certain behaviors are tolerated, that's what they will do. And a very simple way of understanding this is I did some work for the DPME around, it was called the Management Performance Assessment Tool. And what we did was write up case studies of where departments had been effective in changing practices, basically. And one of them was around payment in 60 days. And now, I mean, when I was doing it, this was sort of 2015, 2014, provincially and nationally in those years, only 2 departments managed to pay in 60 days. And one was like the Northern Cape Department of Social Work. And what was the thing that both of those departments did? They actually physically seated both sides of the procurement process in one room. So the people who do the procuring and the people who do the paying were physically put into one room, but also, because it's split for some reason in how the systems work, but also one data system. So I just think we need to recognize that if you want to make a change that's actually going to produce different behaviors in an institution, you have to think about the space in which, and that space isn't just like the physical space, it's also the culture, the practices. One senior person in an institution can make a massive difference in terms of how it works. The other thing is that people actually have to want to change. And if they don't feel they have the agency or space to practice, they won't. So I think a lot of the legislation and the capacitation can address both of those things, but just bear in mind what's the other thing we have to do if we are really going to change behaviors in the state.
Next.
No.
Sam, I think, is next, and then just behind you, Sam.
Hi, thanks. Sam Soul, Amabungani. I want to ask Simon for his views on the dysfunction in Treasury, because in the past we've kind of had a sense of there's at least technical capacity in Treasury, and what was very kind of came through from this whole bill process was that in NEDLAC, as Simon suggested, basically business and labor were on the same page, making the same similar kinds of logical recommendations, and yet Treasury was the odd man out. And even in what we have now, you have this enormous black hole in the bill in terms of a preferential procurement system that is not there. It's obvious to anybody with half a brain, and yet Treasury has not done its job. I'm interested in why, what's going on politically in Treasury, what's going on in terms of its skills and capacity.
Thanks. It's Carol Payton from News 24. I completely agree that the gap, the black hole on preferential procurement is a problem. I wanted to ask the panelists why it is that the Treasury's supplier blacklist doesn't work. So I recently did a story on a company that had just got a 4.7 billion rand contract from Sunroll. Those directors are standing trial for fraud at the moment on another road project. They've also been found guilty of collusion by both Eskom and Pick It Up, which said they were going to get blacklisted, but they're not on the supplier blacklist. And Sunroll says, no, they have to give it to them because they're not guilty of anything. Can somebody explain why it doesn't work?
Thanks, and then online.
All right, we've got about 120 people online. I'll read 2 short questions. The first one is from Ivan Pillay. He says, a big driver of corruption in public procurement is the fundraising model of some political parties. Shouldn't it be unlawful for any contractor to the state to donate to a party directly or indirectly, and for political parties to commit to not accepting funds from these contractors? Second question is from Zukiswa Kota. She says, referring to the current panel and to Prof. Kachalia, advocating for embedding e-government interventions like procurement data portals and dashboards is really vital. But how do we address the very real implementation risks and limitations in the absence of substantive digital governance / artificial intelligence / open data policy in South Africa? We acknowledge that there's work in progress done by the HSRC, DPSA, CSIR in this regard, but relatively limited civil society involvement.
Great, thanks. I'll go to the panelists, and so that we do have space for another round of questions, if you could try and keep your contributions to sort of three minutes. Motlatsi, I'll start with you.
I'll answer some of those. I think I'll start with the Treasury Supply Blacklist and why it doesn't work. This is something that we've been interrogating, actually, because we released a research report on deviations and expansions. And it's so when you go on the Treasury website, there is the restricted suppliers database, and when you click on it, it gives you a blank page, sort of. There's no one on that list. But if you click on the second database, you will see that they've oddly consolidated everything into one database. And so we've interrogated that, so we'll figure it out soon, because we're not sure whether that includes everyone or if it's specific people only in either one of the databases. So I can't really go into detail until we have clear answers around that. But I think that what it speaks to definitely is the fact that there needs to be more clarity on where this information is being housed. There needs to be more clarity on how we can access it. I know that National Treasury says that they do, let people know that there is this information and where it can be found. But perhaps if we're all wondering the same thing, then clearly the system is not as effective as it should be. And then in terms of the e-government question by Zuki, I think that this is a long-standing issue, and I know that different civil society organizations and formations have been involved with National Treasury around Vuleka Mali and really trying to have some of this information uploaded as consistently and as efficiently as possible. But I think, again, it speaks to the capacitation issues that are there in terms of having this information or data as readily available and accessible. And just to say on open data, that in certain instances, we've been told that you can't always provide all data for a wide variety of reasons, because some of the data is private information. And so you've got to maintain a balance around ensuring that you have adequate access to information as a member of the public, but really protecting some of those companies as well. So I think that as part of that process on the e-government and e-portals, I think that we really need to engage with government even more on some of these issues that we're seeing, whether it's inaccuracy in some of the data that has been captured, whether it is, and that has happened once or twice. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. In terms of the dysfunction in Treasury, I think that also speaks to the politics that are happening in government in general. But I'll leave that to Simon, because I think Simon is better placed.
Thanks, Motlatsi. Simon?
Yo. McClatchy, yeah. All right, there's a ticking time bomb with my job security. All right, and just so that you are responded to this, I think you're right. I think behavior comes. I mean, it's not just internally driven and through self-motivation. It's structured through systems and through structures. And so your insight is absolutely right. Whether it's in a a trade union or a government office or a factory or any other or an NGO, behavior is learned through a kind of a greater collective. And that collective is defined by the institutions, the norms, the values, etc., etc., and it's set from the top. And so, I mean, that's a very, very useful insight. Sam, I don't know that I have a sufficiently good insight. Look, I have a little bit of sympathy for the conservatism of a treasury. And it's going to sound really strange for a trade unionist to say that, because our favorite whipping post is a treasury. But any institution where the person holding the purse strings throws the money out of the purse whenever you ask for it is in danger, is in massive danger. And so there is a use, despite the fact that I want different macroeconomic policies and fiscal policies, etc., there is a use in a conservatism within an institution like a treasury. And it's important that we fight with them. So I'll come to that in a moment when I answer this. So the first major challenge, I think, is a skills gap. There were some enormously talented people in Treasury in the past, technically talented. Whether or not they were ideological opponents is a different story, but technically talented people. And we did watch that bleed out. It's not to say that there aren't technically talented people now. There are, including, let me say, the kind of drafters from Treasury are technically talented. Whether or not they know the subject matter sufficiently is a different story. Whether or not there are constraints upon their behavior is a different story. There are talented people, but my assessment would be that over time, there's been a diminishing of skill in the Treasury. And it is something we need to pay attention to. The second one would be culture. And that's why I raised the issue of conservatism, because I think there's a natural inclination towards believing the institution is right, and with some degree of skepticism towards outside parties and the views of outside parties. And I think that carries through in Treasury. Then I think there's like some really unsexy things. I mean, it's really unsexy to say colleagues in Treasury are really busy. But the reality is, the effective public servants are carrying the load of so many people that they're so busy. Does that mean they can provide 100%? They can do a 100% task 100% of the time? And I don't think so. So some of the answer, I think, is, those who carry the load well carry too much of the load. Then I think that there's a question of gatekeeping. I think, your counterparts in a negotiation are negotiating not just on the basis of what they believe they can do, but what they believe their seniors in Treasury, so vertically through Treasury, but horizontally through the rest of the state, will allow them to do. And my assessment was that there was some level of lack of not being sure the extent to which one can move beyond the kind of natural conservatism. And that's a question of time. That's, the real good example was when the Department of Justice came in and said no to whistleblowing, and we had 2 or 3 sessions with them. The way to unlock that is to get them into weekly meetings and talk at them and then talk with them for a long period of time and have a conversation by which you shift the frame of reference. So I think they were probably just managing both real and imagined limitations on their ability to move. I think there could be other things too. It could be more nefarious than that. But Sam, I'm not sure about that. Ivan, it's absolutely lovely to know that you're in the room. A huge loss to the state. You make a really good point. That, and we didn't address this, the nexus and relationship between tenders and political party funding. It's a gap, and to be honest, not something that I think we saw. So we must all put that on our collective to-do lists and bring it back. Zuki's question about data and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, the hard, cold facts, I think, is that the state is a really poor keeper of data. So, 10, 12 years ago, I sat in the Newcastle, no, myself and a colleague were in the Newcastle Department of Labour in KZN, trying to figure out some really abysmal factories and what they were doing with their UIF. It was a complete nightmare because the spelling's all wrong and the data fields are all wrong. I mean, the thing is, it's like it's not workable data. So that was UIF data. Now, subsequently, I've been involved in processes with UIF payments to workers through the COVID period. Go deep into some of that stuff, and there's allegations from the UIF that companies didn't pay UIF for a worker 30 years ago. There's no data to support it. So the data systems in the state are a problem. Ivan, in SARS, when you left, the data management was madness. We have a process of tracking imports and illegal stuff happening on certain kinds of products, and they were unable to provide the data to us for a number of years in the collapse of SARS. Now that's been rebuilt, so that their data management is now far more sophisticated. You can go to the CIPC, the same problem exists. You can go to Treasury, the same problem exists. So even before we get to like real good use of data, we just got really bad data. It's poorly captured. It's badly spelt. It's spelt, the same thing is spelt in 4 different ways. It's in the wrong field. It's just the whole thing is mad at the level of data. So we need to fix that. And I'm not sure how one fixes that. It's possible that one can sort of run intelligent AI through it on sort of processes of data cleansing and matching, create a couple of sort of permutations, or it's possible you just scrap it and rebuild data from the start. When it comes to procurement, that's why I've advocated for the concept of capture the data at the transaction level. When someone wants to spend the money in the state, they got to input it into a system that captures it at Treasury's level or the PPO's level, and then you've got something you can work with. But at this point, I think there's such poor data management and such poor data itself that I think our ability to do things intelligently with data analytics and processing is fundamentally undermined, except in some of those really remarkable spaces. Again, just highlighting SARS and its ability there. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, I'll take another quick round. 1, 2, 3, and then maybe one more online.
I'm hoping Feroz will come back on some of the comments that have been made. I've got one to make. And I think first the acronym. NACUC. Maybe it's a good one. The communications section of Feroz. Oh, is he left? Oh, I'll leave it. But he's back. Good. Get in the hot seat. The communications section of your, one of your areas of work, I think, you hit a lot on the head for me, a nail on the head on a number of points, in particular the political approach, and in particular making, the normative, the norms have been developed around, when you speak to many people about corruption, we've got to change the frame. And I'm hoping you're going to have some serious communication campaigns around changing the frame and linking social issues, delivery in particular, to corruption. I do think, just spending a couple of days this week with state officials and academics and activists, we've got a large part of the dysfunction is the coordination between the various levels of government and between the various departments and overlapping mandates. And I think the big thing for me, Simon, was, how, and for us, how do we begin to pile up the pressure around the procurement bill? How do we popularize it in people's imagination, something which is very dry and technical? Because we know we've got a challenge there. I'd be interested to hear from you, Simon. What can we do apart from the, nice processes that have been going on in NADLAC to sort of ramp up some pressure around the hearings and stuff and around the processes? I think that's critical. And finally, Simon, I think you've got a missed vocation in life. You should be a PowerPoint presentation advisor. Very entertaining. But I do want to ask you a difficult question. And this comes back to the point Ivan raised and Casata Investments. What are you doing to check your own people? Your investments, combined with other investment houses, are amounting to hundreds of billions. And if we go back to Chippy's book on Cape Town, we know, and again it comes back to Feroze's point around how we can get around this system. We know in the city of Cape Town the value chains are genuinely clean, but we know where the money ends up. It ends up in the party coffers, as in many, if not most, municipalities around the country. And I think this comes back to my final point. And Feroze, in some ways, you're guilty of a process which you've very much been involved in, and that's the acceptance of the neoliberal paradigm where the state needs to be rolled back, a smaller state, less regulation, in a context where we know, in a world context, where corruption, the public and private spheres being blurred, has been going on, given the dominance of the neoliberal paradigm and the space where corruption now is becoming the international norm of our political and economic elites. South Africa, there's nothing new about South Africa in that regard. So, and that comes back to the final point of how can we begin to change mindsets when we don't have a clear political vision or mission for our country? How can we expect our civil servants and our public servants to be driven and motivated when we've been turned from citizens into consumers, very much at the center of the neoliberal project?
Okay, we'll have some quick last questions, and then I'll hand over to the panel to finalize. Yes.
Just two quick comments. One to Anne, and you're talking about MPAT and that particular indicator on 30 days. I'm just reminded of the days when I was a consultant, when I would be approached by a department to revise my invoice so that it falls within the 30 days. So people can be very creative when there's a rule and work around it, just on a lighter note. And secondly, another comment to you, Sam, around what's happening in Treasury. I don't speak on behalf of Treasury, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the changes that happened in that particular office of the Chief Procurement Office. The number of acting people since Kenneth left, I think they only got a permanent CPO last year. But during a very critical period of this bill, there were a lot of acting people who were just changing. And whether there was anything nefarious about that or not, but that plays a lot into the issue of capacity of the state. If you keep people acting, not that they won't do their jobs, but if somebody acts for 3 months and another person acts for 6 months, there's just no continuity. And when they are acting, they also still have their jobs to do. Thanks.
Okay, last comment, and then.
Thanks, Mbongiseni from Pari. Motlatsi, I'm curious, you referenced at the beginning of your input the Black Business Council response. And I think this follows from Riyadh's point about communication. The public discourse, I mean, there are certain, the deep technical stuff of the public procurement bill does not ignite the public imagination. But what does is when the BBC comes out and seizes on that section 17 that Simon was talking about to attack NGOs like our favorite Gwede Mantashe does. How do we respond to that? Okay, how has the Budget Justice Coalition responded to that attack from the BBC? How do we keep public communication on these deep technical issues, I think as Riyadh was asking, healthy on one hand, but also how do we get public support for the kinds of positions that we are trying to take?
Okay, so I'll hand to our panelists for Motlasi. You've got a very specific question to answer, and then just perhaps a quick 1-minute wrap-up after that, and then Simon, 2 minutes just to wrap up your input and any responses to the last comments. Feroz, we can have a tea time engagement with Feroz.
Okay, I'll try and be very brief. So just a bit of context. I think the sort of narrative hasn't started now. I remember a few years back, you would go to Parliament and you'd be asked, so who funds you? So that's always been a question that has always come up, particularly when there are topics of contestation or the disagreements between ourselves and public office bearers or anyone who supports them. I think for us as the Budget Justice Coalition, we released a statement in response to that, and in actual fact, we responded to all of the questions that were put before us. We were quite clear. For us, it was an unwarranted, actually, kind of attack, so to speak, because at no point had we really dealt with that, and we hadn't said that we are anti-transformation. And so how we've responded to that is just to be quite open and clear about who funds us, who doesn't fund us, and our mandate. And we've always drawn it back to the kind of the work that we do. So our work is around budget literacy and the realization of socioeconomic rights, and that's our focus. And so we drew it back to that. In terms of the deep technical issues and public support, I think definitely when you have a constituency such as ours, which is different civil society organizations within a coalition who very much speak to issues pertaining to health, education, and so forth, we've all come together with one mandate. And the mandate is to ensure that when we have the budget cycle, we are able to really assist members of the community with access to information. So for us, it's always providing throughout the year access to information, really engaging with the different stakeholders, including National Treasury and government themselves, on what we think our key concerns are. And so that's how we've done it. But also on the public education note, I think that what we learned through and drawing it back to this public procurement process, what we learned was that the bill itself was quite technical. I'm not a procurement expert in the technical sense, but it was quite technical. We had short time frames, and I think this speaks to my earlier point around the fact that because we had short time frames, we could only engage as much as possible. And I think that going forward, we need to do more in terms of really ensuring that we speak to members of the community around our messaging, effective and clear messaging around what public procurement means for them. So if you are seeing that a tender has been awarded or bid has been awarded and someone misappropriated those funds, I mean, if we then equate that to people's lived experiences where they don't have access to adequate roads or they don't have access to transportation, I think that people then generally understand that procurement is a broader issue. But I don't think that we can do public education with the more technical terms without really explaining what some of these things mean. So it's quite a deliberate kind of thing that we need to do as civil society and activists.
Okay, Simon. Simon, you have a minute to wrap up.
Excellent. Okay, I'll do my motor mouth version. So in terms of piling up the pressure, I would roughly propose 4 things. The first is identify practical day-to-day things that can put pressure on the system. We do it in my union. We identify tenders on a daily basis. We engage with public institutions on a daily basis. We lose the battle all the time, and sometimes we win. But you can't get away from daily, everyday work. The second one is to have wide engagements. That would mean engage the largest number of people, to move your opponents, the largest number of your constituency, to try to whittle them down, win some to your side, and over time you win more. The third would be to have a wide coalition to do the work, so the larger number of people working in collaboration, solidarity, etc. And the last would be to have a real simple common message. If I come to the problem of union investments and whether they're doing the right thing, I mean, it's an open secret that there's tragedy in many of the union investment companies in the way that they're managed, in the way that benefits are taken out of them, not distributed to workers. Is there sufficient oversight? No, in many of the union investment companies. Must there be much better? Absolutely. If I wrap up my final couple of statements, if I look forward for the next 10, 15 years, it seems to me our biggest task is going to be rebuilding institutions. I mean, that really is what we're doing. Whether we're rebuilding procurement systems, whether we're rebuilding departments, whether we are rebuilding the state and its role as an enabler and catalyst for development. But we're doing the same with small businesses, medium businesses. We're doing it with trade unions. We need to do it with the NGOs. So I want to sort of put on the agenda that really what we're going to be dealing with is institution building. To do that, my sense is, and I'm sorry if this is insulting to colleagues, as activists, I think we need to start being more like engineers. So, the good thing about being activist is the sense of moral purpose and energy and passion. The challenge with being activist is often we don't really know the deep mechanical systems. We don't know the fix-it, we know the problem. And so I think there's going to have to be a reorientation from people who identify themselves as activists to being more like engineers. The third one is I think we're going to have to deal with the tendency to be the circular firing squad, where we kind of club each other and moor each other because we have the narcissism of small difference. I think we're going to have to identify the big things that hold us together and begin to move on that basis. And the last one is I think we're going to have to do a lot more claiming our agency and not looking up to someone else. As a movement, in my movement, in the trade union movement, we hate outsourcing, we hate the casualization of labor, and yet in my movement, but I see it with other activists, we are outsourcing our power all the time to other people. We'll tell you what to do and you do it. For the imagination, strange imagination is that someone else has more power than us. So I think as part of the next 10-year vision, 15-year vision, it's claiming our agency, not looking upwards for someone else to solve problems, but taking much more charge of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, so I think maybe my handling of the panel hasn't been quite up to scratch from the reffing standards that we expect this weekend, but I'd really like to thank our champion panelists, Motlate Siyakhulisi Kumote and Simon Oxenchair-Ippel. Thank you very much for a very enlightening session.
Yes, thank you very much. And you kept to time. Thank you so much for that. We are going to break for tea. And we'll be back here at 1:45, and I'm sure Feroz must just open a table up there for the questions directed to him. So we'll see at 1:45, what is it? 1:45.